Hey everyone! Today, let's dive into the fascinating story of King Saul, the first king of Israel. This tale is straight from the pages of the Hebrew Bible and the Old Testament, and it's packed with drama, intrigue, and tragedy. So, King Saul was the very first monarch of the United Kingdom of Israel, way back in the late 11th century BCE. His reign marked a huge shift for Israel and Judah, transforming them from a bunch of scattered tribes into a more organized state. But it's worth mentioning that the historical accuracy of Saul and his kingdom isn't universally accepted, since all we know comes from the Hebrew Bible. According to the Bible, Saul was chosen as king by the prophet Samuel and ruled from Gibeah. His reign, however, ended in tragedy. During a fierce battle with the Philistines at Mount Gilboa, Saul and 3 of his sons were killed. In a desperate moment, Saul fell on his sword to avoid capture. After his death, his son Ishbosheth took the throne but was later murdered by his own military leaders. Eventually, David, Saul's son-in-law, became king. The story of Saul is filled with inconsistencies and intriguing twists. There are conflicting accounts of how he was anointed as king and how he died. Initially, he's portrayed positively, but after David enters the scene, Saul's image takes a dark turn. Some scholars even believe that parts of the story about Samuel's birth were originally about Saul. Saul's reign is another point of debate. The Hebrew text says he ruled for 2 years, but most agree that he probably reigned for about 20 or 22 years. The New Testament book of Acts even suggests he ruled for 40 years. Saul was from the tribe of Benjamin, the son of Kish, and he came from Gibeah. He married Ahinoam, and together they had 5 sons and 2 daughters. Saul also had a concubine named Rizpah, who bore him 2 more sons. When Saul died at Mount Gilboa, he was buried in Zelah in the Benjamin region. His son Ishbosheth became king but was murdered after just 2 years. During a famine, God told King David it was because of Saul's mistreatment of the Gibeonites. To make amends, the Gibeonites demanded the death of 7 of Saul's descendants. David handed over 2 of Saul's sons and 5 grandsons, who were then executed. Their bodies were hung in public for 5 months, and Saul's concubine Rizpah protected them from scavengers until David had them buried properly. The only male descendant of Saul to survive was Mephibosheth, Jonathan's son, who was lame and just 5 years old when his father and grandfather died. He later came under David's protection and had a son named Micah, continuing Saul's lineage. And now let's delve into how he was appointed as king and some of his significant early actions. The first book of Samuel gives us 3 accounts of Saul's rise to kingship. In the first account, Saul is sent by his father to search for some lost donkeys. With his servant, he travels from his home in Gibeah to the district of Zuph. After a fruitless search, Saul is ready to give up, but his servant suggests they visit a famous seer in the nearby town of Ramah. This seer, who turns out to be Samuel, offers Saul hospitality and privately anoints him as king. The second account involves a more public selection. A movement had begun among the Israelites to establish a centralized monarchy like their neighboring nations. Samuel gathers the people at Mizpah in Benjamin to fulfill his promise of appointing a king. Using the Urim and Thummim, sacred lots used to reveal God's will, Samuel narrows down the selection to the tribe of Benjamin, the clan of Matri, and finally, Saul. Despite some public dissent, Saul returns home to Gibeah with a group of followers. In the third account, the Ammonites, led by Nahash, lay siege to Jabesh Gilead and demand that the city's inhabitants become slaves and have their right eyes removed. The desperate occupants send word to the other tribes of Israel. Saul rallies an army from the tribes west of the Jordan and leads them to a decisive victory over the Ammonites. The people then gather at Gilgal to celebrate Saul's victory, acclaim him as king, and crown him. Notably, Saul's first royal decree is to forbid any retribution against those who had previously opposed his kingship. After being anointed by Samuel, Saul experiences several signs indicating his divine appointment. One significant sign involves Saul meeting a group of ecstatic prophets playing musical instruments. He joins them, overtaken by the Spirit of God, and begins to prophesy alongside them. Saul's early reign is marked by military victories. He leads successful campaigns against the Moabites, Ammonites, Edomites, the kings of Zobah, the Philistines, and the Amalekites. A biblical summary praises his military prowess, stating that, wherever he turned, he was victorious. In the second year of his reign, Saul, his son Jonathan, and a small force of Israelite soldiers face a massive Philistine army at the pass of Michmash. Despite being outnumbered, they achieve a remarkable victory. However, in a hasty move, Saul commands his army to fast, thinking it would save time and prevent the Philistines from regrouping. This decision backfires as the soldiers, weakened from hunger, struggle to pursue their enemies effectively. Jonathan, unaware of his father's command, eats honey and realizes he has broken the oath. Despite the gravity of this breach, the people intervene, recognizing Jonathan's critical role in the victory, and save him from death. During Saul's campaign against the Philistines, Samuel had told him that he would arrive in 7 days to perform the necessary rites. When the week passed without any sign of Samuel and the Israelites grew restless, Saul decided to take matters into his own hands and offered the sacrifices himself. Just as Saul was finishing, Samuel arrived and reprimanded him for not obeying his instructions. Several years later, after Saul's victory against the Philistines at Michmash Pass, Samuel instructed him to make war on the Amalekites and to utterly destroy them, including all their livestock. This was in fulfillment of a divine mandate. When the Lord your God has given you rest from all your enemies on every hand, in the land that the Lord your God is giving you as an inheritance to possess, you shall blot out the remembrance of Amalek from under heaven. Do not forget. Saul forewarned the Kenites living among the Amalekites to leave, and then went to war, defeating the Amalekites. He killed all the men, women, children, and poor-quality livestock, but spared the king, Agag, and the best livestock. When Samuel learned of Saul's disobedience and that he had plundered the livestock for self-gain, he informed Saul that God had rejected him as king. As Samuel turned to leave, Saul seized his garment, tearing a piece off. Samuel then prophesied that the kingdom would likewise be torn from Saul. Samuel killed Agag himself and then returned home, never to meet Saul again. Following Saul's rejection, David, the son of Jesse from the tribe of Judah, enters the story, marking the beginning of Saul's increasingly troubled relationship with David. Samuel went to Bethlehem, ostensibly to offer a sacrifice, and invited Jesse and his sons. One by one, Jesse's sons were brought before Samuel, but each was rejected. Finally, Jesse sent for David, the youngest, who was tending sheep. When David was brought to Samuel, he was anointed in front of his brothers. In 1 Samuel 16:25-23, Saul is troubled by an evil spirit sent by God. He requests soothing music, and a servant recommends David, who was renowned for his skills as a harpist, his valor, his prudence in speech, and his handsome appearance. When word of Saul's needs reached Jesse, he sent David with gifts as a tribute, and David was appointed as Saul's armor-bearer. With Jesse's permission, David remained at court, playing the harp to calm Saul during his troubled spells. The Philistines returned with an army to attack Israel, and the forces gathered on opposite sides of a valley. The Philistine champion, Goliath, issued a challenge for single combat, but none of the Israelites accepted. David, a young shepherd delivering food to his 3 eldest brothers in the army, heard Goliath's challenge. Speaking mockingly of the Philistines, his speech was overheard and reported to Saul, who summoned David and appointed him as his champion. David defeated Goliath with a single shot from his sling. After the victory, Saul asked his general, Abner, who David was. Saul offered his elder daughter, Merab, as a wife to the now popular David, but David demurred. David continued to distinguish himself in the Philistine wars, and upon his return from battle, the women praised him in song. Saul has slain his thousands and David his tens of thousands, implying that David was the greater warrior. Saul feared David's growing popularity and viewed him as a rival to the throne. Saul's son Jonathan and David became close friends. Jonathan recognized David as the rightful king and made a covenant with him, giving David his military clothes, symbolizing his position as Saul's successor. On 2 occasions, Saul threw a spear at David as he played the harp for him. David became increasingly successful, and Saul's resentment grew, leading him to actively plot against David. Saul offered his other daughter, Michal, in marriage to David. David initially rejected the offer, claiming he was too poor, but Saul agreed to accept a bride price of 100 Philistine foreskins, hoping David would die in the attempt. Instead, David obtained 200 foreskins and married Michal. Jonathan arranged a short-lived reconciliation between Saul and David, but Saul's distressing spirit from the Lord reappeared, leading him to send assassins to kill David in the night. Michal helped David escape by placing a household idol in his bed to trick the assassins. David fled to Jonathan, who arranged a meeting with Saul. At dinner, Jonathan explained David's absence, but Saul saw through the ruse, reprimanded Jonathan for protecting David, and furiously threw a spear at him. Jonathan warned David, and they said their goodbyes, with David fleeing into the countryside. Later, Saul married Michal to another man. Saul was informed by his head shepherd, Doeg the Edomite, that the high priest Ahimelech had assisted David, giving him the sword of Goliath. Doeg killed Ahimelech and 85 other priests, and Saul ordered the death of the entire population of Nob. David, now leading a group of 300 dissatisfied men, including outlaws, rescued the town of Keilah from a Philistine attack. Saul saw an opportunity to trap David by laying siege to Keilah, but David realized the citizens would betray him and fled to Ziph. Saul pursued David to Ziph on 2 occasions. Some inhabitants of Ziph betrayed David's location, but he fled to Maon. Saul followed, but was forced to break off the pursuit when the Philistines invaded. After dealing with the Philistines, Saul tracked David to the caves at En-Gedi. David managed to cut off a piece of Saul's robe without being discovered, and later revealed himself to Saul, giving a speech that persuaded Saul to reconcile. On the second occasion, Saul returned to Ziph with his men. David slipped into Saul's camp by night, restraining his men from killing the king, and instead stole Saul's spear and water jug, leaving his own spear by Saul's side. The next day, David revealed himself, showing the jug and spear as proof that he could have killed Saul. Saul was persuaded to reconcile, and they swore never to harm each other. After this, they never saw each other again. The Philistines made war again, assembling at Shunem. Saul led his army to face them at Mount Gilboa. Before the battle, he consulted a medium at Endor, who conjured a spirit resembling the prophet Samuel. The spirit told Saul that God had rejected him, given the kingdom to David, and that he would lose both the battle and his life the next day. Saul collapsed in fear, and the medium restored him with food. The narrator and 1 Chronicles 10 describes Saul's death, but a conflicting account is given by a young Amalekite. The defeated Israelites fled, and Saul asked his armor-bearer to kill him. When he refused, Saul fell on his own sword. The Amalekite later claimed he found Saul leaning on his spear and delivered the final blow. David had the Amalekite put to death, emphasizing that he would never kill the Lord's anointed king. The victorious Philistines recovered Saul's body and those of his 3 sons, who also died in the battle. They decapitated them and displayed them on the wall of Beth-shan, placing Saul's armor in the temple of Ashtaroth. At night, the inhabitants of Jabesh-Gilead retrieved the bodies for cremation and burial. Later, David took the bones of Saul and Jonathan and buried them in Zelah, in the tomb of Saul's father. 1 Chronicles summarizes Saul's death as a result of his unfaithfulness to God and consulting a medium for guidance. Biblical scholars have discussed the conflicting accounts of Saul's rise to kingship and death, as well as the narrative shifts around David's appearance. Initially presented positively, Saul's character later deteriorates, possibly indicating the influence of sources loyal to the house of David. Various attempts have been made to harmonize the narratives of Saul's death, suggesting redaction from multiple sources or the Amalekite lying to gain favor with David. There are two main perspectives on Saul found in classical rabbinical literature. One view, which sees punishment as proof of guilt, seeks to diminish Saul's reputation. This interpretation suggests that Saul's positive attributes, such as being described as a choice young man and goodly, only refer to his appearance and not his character. According to this view, Saul's kingship was not due to his merits but rather to the good deeds of his grandfather, who lit the streets for those going to the Beit Midrash, and received a promise that one of his grandsons would sit on the throne. The second view presents Saul in a much more favorable light, portraying him as a modest, upright, and just man. This perspective highlights Saul's humility in not revealing that he had been anointed king, and emphasizes his piety and purity. He is described as extraordinarily handsome, so much so that the maidens who spoke to him about Samuel did so at length to admire his beauty. In battle, Saul was tireless, able to march 120 miles without rest. His reluctance to destroy the Amalekites entirely, questioning why the young and cattle should suffer for the sins of the old, is seen as an act of compassion that ultimately cost him his crown. While Saul was merciful to his enemies, he was strict with his own people. When he discovered that Ahimelech, a priest, had assisted David, Saul ordered the death of Ahimelech and 85 other priests, as well as the destruction of their town, Nob. Saul's single act of mercy toward a foe was seen as his only sin, while David, who had committed many sins, was favored by God. In some respects, Saul was considered superior to David, having only one concubine, Rizpah, and using his own resources for war. Despite knowing he and his sons would die in battle, Saul courageously led his troops, unlike David, who avoided personal involvement in battle due to his soldiers' wishes. The rabbis also excused Saul's actions towards David, blaming his courtiers in Doeg for slandering David. Saul's strict adherence to ritual purity and his teaching of proper cattle slaughtering earned him a divine sword in battle. His anger at the Gibeonites and his actions regarding his daughter's marriage to David were explained as zeal for Israel's welfare and a belief that the betrothal was invalid. Saul maintained Israel's purity from idolatry during his reign, and the famine during David's rule was attributed to the people's failure to honor Saul properly at his burial. In the afterlife, Saul was assured a place with Samuel, indicating God's forgiveness. In Islam, in the Quran, Saul is identified as Talut. According to Islamic tradition, Talut was chosen by the prophet Samuel to lead the Israelites in battle, despite their initial rejection of him due to his lack of wealth. Samuel defended God's choice, emphasizing Talut's knowledge and physical stature. Talut led the Israelites to victory over Goliath's army, with David killing Goliath. This account shows Talut as a divinely appointed king. The name Talut means tall, reflecting Saul's notable height. The Quran describes how God confirmed Talut's kingship by returning the Ark of the Covenant to Israel. Talut tested his followers' faith by seeing who would refrain from drinking from a river, and only the faithful followed him into battle. This account differs from the Bible, where the ark is returned before Saul's accession and the test by water is attributed to Gideon. And the historicity of Saul's kingdom is debated. Some scholars argue that archaeological evidence supports the existence of a united monarchy under Saul, David, and Solomon, albeit with some theological embellishments. Others, like Israel Finkelstein, suggest that the concept of a unified kingdom is a later ideological construct. The Jewish Study Bible notes a lack of evidence for a united monarchy. However, Evidence suggests that Israelite society remained largely agrarian and decentralized until around 1000 BCE.